7 Golden Age stars born with deformities. Hollywood's Golden Age created gods and goddesses out of flesh and blood, perfect specimens whose immaculate faces loomed over America from 3-story movie posters and silver screens the size of buildings. But behind this manufactured perfection lurked a more human truth, carefully concealed by studio publicity machines, desperate to maintain the illusion. The studio's obsession with physical perfection was pathological, revealed a former MGM publicity director who worked during the system's heyday. Stars weren't just expected to act well. They were expected to embody physical ideals that almost no human being could naturally achieve. Those born with even minor physical differences faced extraordinary pressure to hide, correct, or compensate for them. This ruthless standard created a cruel paradox for actors born with physical differences or deformities. Their unusual features might help them stand out during auditions, but would then become liabilities requiring elaborate concealment once they achieved stardom. What the public never saw were the painful procedures, restrictive clothing, camera tricks, and psychological toll that maintaining this illusion exacted. The publicity departments operated like military intelligence agencies, explained a film historian specializing in studio system practices. They suppressed medical records, intimidated journalists who asked uncomfortable questions, and created entirely fictional biographies for stars whose real bodies didn't match the studio's ideal. The cover-ups were comprehensive and remarkably effective. Despite these efforts, whispers circulated through Hollywood about the physical realities being hidden from public view. The surgeries, the special shoes, the strategic camera angles that transformed imperfect bodies into screen ideals. Even stars, considered the epitome of physical perfection, often concealed conditions that would have shattered their carefully constructed images. What makes these stories particularly poignant is that many of these actors delivered their greatest performances while simultaneously battling physical challenges the audience never knew about, noted a classic film biographer. They weren't just acting their roles, they were acting normalcy itself, performing physical perfection, while their bodies told a very different story. These 7 Golden Age legends reveal the gap between Hollywood's manufactured perfection and the physical realities that studios work tirelessly to conceal. Stories of remarkable talent overcoming not just the usual hurdles to stardom, but the additional burden of bodies that didn't conform to the industry's merciless standards.
By what has been called my infamous conduct, I have done anything, however small, to benefit humanity. I am more than proud, gentlemen. I am profoundly grateful.
Robert Donat, the star who struggled to breathe. When Robert Donat delivered his Oscar-winning performance as the beloved schoolmaster in Goodbye, Mr. Chips, 1939, audiences were captivated by his character's journey from youth to old age. A physical transformation executed with remarkable subtlety and conviction. What those viewers never knew was that Donat's greatest performance was happening off-camera. The daily struggle to manage severe chronic asthma that threatened his career and ultimately shortened his life. Donat's asthma wasn't just an occasional inconvenience, it was a career-threatening disability in an era with limited treatment options, explained a film historian who has studied the actor's career. Combined with the mild scoliosis that affected his posture, he was constantly battling physical limitations that would have ended most acting careers before they began. Born with asthma so severe that attacks could render him completely unable to speak, Donat faced a fundamental challenge for an actor: the unreliability of his most essential tool, his voice. Throughout his career, his breathing would suddenly constrict during filming, forcing productions to shut down until he could recover, sometimes for days or weeks. MGM and other studios went to extraordinary lengths to accommodate Donat's condition while simultaneously concealing it from the public, noted a production assistant who worked on several of Donat's films. Schedules were built around his good days. Emergency medical personnel were kept just off set. Scenes were filmed in tiny fragments when necessary, allowing him to rest between takes. These accommodations came with significant professional costs. Donat was forced to reject numerous roles that might have made him an even bigger star, including the lead in The Citadel and other physically demanding parts that his fragile health couldn't support. His filmography remained relatively small compared to other actors of his stature, precisely because his body could not withstand a demanding production schedule. What's remarkable about Donat is how he adapted his acting technique to work around his physical limitations, observed an acting coach who has studied Donat's performances. He developed an economical, precise approach that minimized physical exertion while maximizing emotional impact. the very constraints imposed by his condition may have contributed to the restraint and subtlety that made his performances so powerful. Studio publicity departments worked overtime to conceal the extent of Donat's health struggles, crafting an image of quiet strength that bore little resemblance to his daily reality. Press releases attributed production delays to script problems or technical issues rather than the star's inability to breathe. Photographs were carefully selected to mask any visible effects of his scoliosis on his posture. The gap between Donat's public image and his physical reality was enormous, said the film historian. Audiences who watched him portray vigorous characters like the Count of Monte Cristo had no idea that between takes he might be gasping for breath, using primitive inhalers, or receiving emergency treatment. As Donat aged, his asthma worsened, making each film more challenging than the last. By the early 1950s, he was able to work only sporadically, his once promising career limited by a body that betrayed him with increasing frequency. He died in 1958 at just 53 years old, his lungs finally giving out after decades of struggle. Donat's story reveals something profound about acting as an art form, reflected a biographer who has written extensively about the actor. His greatest performance was not any single role, but the daily act of appearing stronger, healthier, and more physically robust than he actually was. He played normal so convincingly that audiences never suspected the physical torment behind the performance. While Donat battled a condition that affected his ability to perform, our next star faced a different challenge. Features that didn't meet Hollywood's exacting standards for feminine beauty, requiring surgical intervention before her career could even begin.
Next Friday evening, at the Oliver Jordans, dinner at 8. Me eating with Lord and Lady Faincliffe.
Jean Harlow, the platinum bombshell surgically created. Jean Harlow epitomized Hollywood glamour in the 1930s. The original platinum blonde whose sensual screen presence in films like Red Dust and Dinner at 8 established her as cinema's definitive sex symbol. With her perfect profile featured in countless publicity photographs, Harlow's face became one of the most famous and desired in the world. What audiences never knew was that the perfect jawline they admired had been surgically created at MGM's insistence before Harlow even turned 20 years old. Harlow was born with a receding chin and a somewhat weaker jawline than what became her famous profile, revealed a Hollywood cosmetic surgeon whose father worked with many Golden Age stars. In today's world, her natural face would likely be accepted without comment, but in the unforgiving beauty standards of 1930s Hollywood, it was considered a career-ending flaw that required immediate surgical correction. When Harlow signed with MGM in 1932, the studio immediately identified her jawline as a problem that needed fixing before she could be properly marketed as a sex symbol. At the studio's insistence, she underwent what would now be considered an early form of chin augmentation and jawline reconstruction. Painful, relatively primitive procedures performed with none of the safety protocols or refined techniques available to modern cosmetic surgeons. These early cosmetic procedures were essentially experimental, explained a medical historian who has studied Hollywood's influence on plastic surgery development. Techniques for facial augmentation were in their infancy, using materials we would consider shocking today, including paraffin wax and early synthetic substances that could shift, become infected, or cause long-term complications. Following the surgery, MGM's publicity department worked to erase any evidence of Harlow's pre-surgical appearance. Early photographs were removed from circulation or heavily retouched to retroactively apply her new profile to her previous images. Journalists were given strict guidelines never to mention any changes to her appearance, under threat of losing access to all MGM stars. The studio created an elaborate fiction that Harlow had always looked exactly as audiences saw her on screen, said a film archivist who has studied surviving pre-surgery images of the actress. They were effectively gaslighting the public, insisting that her surgically created features were natural while suppressing any evidence to the contrary. What makes Harlow's case particularly poignant is that the surgical alterations to her face may have contributed to her fragile self-image and complicated relationship with her own status as a sex symbol. Friends reported that she often expressed discomfort with being valued primarily for an appearance that she knew had been artificially created to meet the studio's standards. "There's something deeply ironic about Harlow's situation," observed a feminist film critic. "She became famous for a sensuality that was presented as natural and effortless, when in reality, even her basic facial structure had been artificially constructed to match the studio's blueprint for female desirability. Her entire career was built on physical alterations she had little choice but to accept. Harlow's premature death at age 26 from kidney failure meant she never had to navigate the aging process with her surgically modified features, an additional challenge that later stars with similar procedures would face. But her case established a pattern that would become standard practice in Hollywood: the surgical modification of young actors to meet artificial beauty standards, followed by elaborate cover-ups to maintain the illusion of natural perfection. Harlow essentially became the prototype for a particular kind of manufactured star, concluded the film historian. She demonstrated that with the right combination of surgical intervention and publicity control, studios could literally create physical perfection rather than simply finding it. That approach fundamentally changed how Hollywood cast and marketed its female stars for decades to come. While Harlow's features were surgically altered to match Hollywood's beauty standards, our next star took a radically different approach, transforming features that might have been considered flaws into the distinctive trademarks that defined his screen persona.
Oh, that's very unfair. That's very
Peter Lorre, the character actor who made Different unforgettable. With his distinctive bulging eyes, asymmetrical features, and unforgettable voice, Peter Lorre created some of cinema's most memorable characters in classics like M, Casablanca, and The Maltese Falcon. Unlike stars who struggled to hide their physical differences, Lorre made his unusual appearance central to his acting persona, creating a unique screen presence that directors like Alfred Hitchcock and John Huston considered irreplaceable. Lorre was born with a significant facial asymmetry and exophthalmos, the medical term for protruding eyeballs, likely related to thyroid dysfunction, explained a medical historian who has studied physical conditions of Golden Age celebrities. In our contemporary understanding, he would probably be diagnosed with mild Graves' disease or a similar thyroid condition affecting the orbital tissues. These physical differences would have disqualified most aspiring actors from leading roles, particularly during an era when classical proportions and conventional attractiveness dominated casting decisions. But Lorre's extraordinary talent and the unsettling intensity of his performances turned features that might have been considered deformities into powerful dramatic assets. What made Lorre's approach revolutionary was his refusal to downplay his distinctive appearance, noted a film historian specializing in character actors. Instead of trying to minimize his bulging eyes or facial asymmetry through lighting tricks or camera angles, he incorporated them into his characterizations. His physical differences became inseparable from the unsettling, sometimes menacing energy he brought to his roles. This embrace of his natural appearance represented a stark contrast to the studio system's typical approach of concealing or correcting physical differences. Rather than submitting to surgical corrections or limiting his range of expression to hide his features, Lorre developed a performance style that made his distinctive look an essential component of his screen presence. Directors quickly recognized that Lorre's eyes weren't a liability, but an incredible dramatic tool, explained a cinematographer who studied classic film lighting techniques. In films like M, the way light caught his protruding eyes created an intensity that couldn't be replicated by actors with more conventional features. What might have been considered a flaw became one of cinema's most recognizable and effective visual signatures. Lorre's success with his unconventional appearance came with significant professional limitations, however. Despite his extraordinary talent, he was largely confined to character roles and villains, rarely given the opportunity to play romantic leads or conventional heroes, despite his demonstrated range as a performer. The same industry that profited from Lorre's distinctive appearance also pigeonholed him because of it, observed a casting director who has studied typecast actors. He was permitted to succeed precisely because his different appearance could be marketed as unsettling or exotic. The studios simultaneously exploited and limited him based on physical features he couldn't control. What makes Lorre's case particularly significant is how it illuminates the double standard applied to male versus female actors with unconventional appearances. While women like Harlow were required to undergo surgical corrections before being considered marketable, men like Laurie were occasionally permitted to succeed with their natural differences intact, though only in carefully restricted roles that often emphasized those differences as markers of villainy or foreignness. Laurie found a narrow path to success that wasn't available to most actors with physical differences, especially women, noted the film historian. He was allowed to keep his distinctive features and even emphasize them, but only because those features aligned with the types of other characters Hollywood needed someone to play. His physical appearance simultaneously made his career possible and severely constrained it. Despite these limitations, Laurie's impact on cinema remains profound, a testament to his ability to transform what might have been considered physical liabilities into the foundation of an unforgettable screen presence that continues to influence actors and filmmakers to this day.
Cases on record, there's not one single case of suicide by leap from the rear end of a moving train. And you know how fast that train was going?
Edward G. Robinson, the unconventional face of American cinema. With his distinctive wide face, prominent forehead, and unconventional features, Edward G. Robinson seemed an unlikely candidate for Hollywood stardom during an era obsessed with classically handsome leading men. Yet, through sheer force of talent, he became one of American cinema's most recognizable and respected actors, despite physical characteristics that some biographers believe may have resulted from a mild craniofacial condition. Robinson's facial structure was distinctly unusual, noted a medical historian with expertise in identifying historical figures with congenital conditions. The particular combination of his broad cranium, widely spaced eyes, and distinctive facial proportions suggests the possibility of a mild form of craniofacial dysplasia, a congenital condition affecting skull and facial development. While never diagnosed during his lifetime, his appearance is consistent with the milder manifestations of such conditions. Whether Robinson's distinctive appearance resulted from a specific medical condition or simply unusual genetic heritage, its impact on his career was significant. Despite his extraordinary talent, demonstrated in classics like Little Caesar, Double Indemnity, and Key Largo, he was immediately relegated to character roles and tough guy parts, effectively locked out of the romantic leading man category, regardless of his acting abilities. Robinson faced immediate typecasting based purely on his physical appearance, explained a casting director who has studied Golden Age casting patterns. Studio executives took one look at his unconventional face and decided he could only play gangsters, villains, or occasionally gruff but well-meaning authority figures. The possibility that he might play a conventional romantic lead was never even considered, despite his immense talent. What makes Robinson's story remarkable is how he transcended these limitations through sheer force of talent, creating performances so compelling that audiences looked past his unconventional appearance to the characters he embodied. His Caesar Enrico Bandello in Little Caesar became one of cinema's most iconic portrayals, his distinctive appearance becoming inseparable from the character's menacing authority. Robinson essentially rewrote the rules about what a movie star could look like, observed a film critic specializing in Golden Age cinema. He couldn't change Hollywood's narrow beauty standards, but he could deliver performances so undeniable that audiences accepted and even embraced his distinctive appearance as part of what made him compelling on screen. Unlike some stars with physical differences, Robinson never publicly acknowledged any insecurity about his appearance. Instead, he focused obsessively on his craft, developing acting techniques that drew attention to his expressive eyes and remarkable vocal control rather than his unconventional facial structure. Robinson's approach to his appearance was essentially to ignore it and make everyone else do the same through the sheer power of his performances, said a biographer who has studied the actor extensively. He never discussed feeling limited by his looks or expressed any desire to change them. He simply acted with such commitment and skill that his appearance became secondary to his talent. This approach paid extraordinary dividends over a 5-decade career that eventually included more than 100 films and a reputation as one of America's finest actors. While never conventionally handsome, Robinson achieved a different kind of screen immortality, his distinctive face becoming one of cinema's most recognizable and respected. What Robinson achieved was remarkable in an industry built around conventional beauty standards, reflected the film historian. He couldn't change Hollywood's obsession with physical appearance, but he could demonstrate so definitively that talent mattered more that the industry was forced to make space for his unconventional face among its pantheon of stars. While Robinson found ways to work within a system biased against his physical appearance, Our next subject faced a more complex and ultimately tragic situation, a combination of physical and psychological challenges that the studio system proved ill-equipped to accommodate. Frances Farmer, the star whose body and mind were never her own. Frances Farmer possessed extraordinary beauty and raw talent that briefly made her one of Hollywood's most promising young actresses in the late 1930s. Behind her striking on-screen presence, however, lay physical and psychological challenges that the studio system neither understood nor accommodated, beginning with an early childhood surgery that may have established a pattern of medical interventions without her full consent. Farmer was born with what family accounts describe as a cranial abnormality that required surgical intervention when she was still an infant, explained a medical historian who has researched early childhood surgeries. The exact nature of this condition isn't clearly documented in surviving records, but it appears to have involved abnormal skull development that doctors believed required correction through what would have been a relatively primitive procedure in the early 1910s. This early surgery, while apparently successful in addressing the immediate physical concern, may have had lasting neurological effects. Throughout her life, Farmer suffered from severe migraines and mood disturbances that some medical historians believe could have been related to her early cranial intervention, particularly given the limited understanding of neurological development available to surgeons of that era. Early cranial surgeries often had unexpected long-term consequences that wouldn't have been anticipated at the time, noted a neurologist who has studied historical medical procedures. The connections between cranial structure, brain development, and conditions like migraines or mood disorders simply weren't understood. It's entirely possible that Farmer's lifelong struggles with headaches and emotional regulation had roots in her infant surgery. When Farmer arrived in Hollywood in the mid-1930s, these underlying physical and neurological issues were compounded by the extraordinary pressures of the studio system. Paramount executives, unaware of or indifferent to her medical history, expected her to maintain a punishing schedule while projecting the perfect image they had designed for her. Farmer's studio handlers had no concept of accommodating her physical or psychological needs, said a film historian specializing in actress biographies. When she experienced debilitating migraines that interfered with filming, she was labeled difficult rather than someone with legitimate medical concerns. When she displayed emotional volatility that may have had neurological underpinnings, she was considered temperamental and problematic. The true tragedy of Farmer's story emerged as her struggles intensified. Rather than receiving appropriate medical care for what may have been a combination of physical and psychological conditions, she became the victim of increasingly invasive and punitive interventions, culminating in her involuntary commitment to a mental institution and an eventual lobotomy that permanently damaged the brain that had already suffered since infancy. Farmer's case represents a perfect storm of medical mismanagement, observed a psychiatrist who has studied historical treatment of female patients. She likely had legitimate neurological issues stemming from her early surgery, combined with possible psychological conditions that required proper treatment. Instead, she received escalating punishment disguised as therapy, culminating in a lobotomy that effectively ended any chance of recovery. What makes Farmer's story particularly relevant to our understanding of physical differences in Golden Age Hollywood is how it demonstrates the studio system's complete inability to accommodate stars whose bodies or minds function differently from the expected norm. Rather than adapting to her needs, the system demanded that she adapt to its requirements, regardless of the physical or psychological cost. Farmer's trajectory reveals the darkest aspects of Hollywood's approach to difficult bodies, concluded the film historian. When stars couldn't or wouldn't conform to the physical and behavioral standards the studios demanded, the response wasn't accommodation but elimination, either through career destruction, as in Farmer's case, or through forced medical interventions that prioritized compliance over well-being. The tragic arc of Farmer's career, from promising starlet to institutionalized patient, stands as a stark reminder of how completely the studio system could destroy those who, whether through physical difference or psychological uniqueness, failed to fit its rigid mold of perfection.
I have 4 usually during the 4 or 5, and I usually use those for sleep.
Raymond Burr, the leading man who hid his limp. Raymond Burr dominated American television for decades as the indomitable attorney Perry Mason and the wheelchair-using detective Robert Ironside, powerful, authoritative figures whose physical presence commanded every scene. What viewers never knew was that Burr himself may have dealt with a physical limitation throughout his career, a reportedly deformed or shortened leg that required special accommodations and careful staging to conceal from audiences. Burr's situation represents one of Hollywood's more successful cover-ups, noted a television historian who has researched physical differences among classic TV stars. While there are consistent behind-the-scenes accounts of him having a significant limp and needing specially modified shoes, this information never reached the public during his lifetime. The studio system's ability to hide such a visible physical difference for decades demonstrates just how effectively they could control information when motivated to protect a valuable star. According to accounts from crew members and fellow actors, Burr was born with one leg shorter than the other, possibly due to a congenital condition or early childhood injury. The difference was significant enough to create a noticeable limp when he walked, potentially threatening his ability to play the physically imposing, authoritative characters that became his trademark. The production teams on Burr's shows developed elaborate systems to work around his physical limitation while ensuring viewers never suspected anything, explained a former camera operator who worked on Perry Mason. Sets were designed with strategic furniture placement so he could lean or sit during long scenes. Camera angles were carefully planned to avoid shooting him walking whenever possible. When movement was necessary, tracking shots would be arranged to minimize the visibility of his gait. Burr himself reportedly wore specially designed shoes with a significant lift on one side to help equalize his leg length and reduce his limp. These custom shoes, combined with carefully tailored pants that concealed their modified design, created the illusion of physical symmetry that millions of viewers never questioned. What's particularly interesting about Burr's case is how his partial concealment became complete concealment through his role as Ironside, observed the television historian. By playing a detective who used a wheelchair, Burr eliminated any need to hide his walking difficulties during that series. It was a role perfectly suited to his specific physical situation, though audiences had no idea why. Unlike some stars who resented the accommodations their physical differences required, Burr apparently accepted these arrangements as simply part of his professional reality. He neither publicly acknowledged his condition nor appeared to feel diminished by the need to work around it. Instead, he focused on building one of television's most successful and enduring careers. Burr's approach to his physical difference reflects a particular philosophy common among male stars of his generation, noted a biographer who has studied several actors with hidden physical limitations. He treated it as a technical problem to be solved rather than a personal challenge to be discussed. The goal wasn't to advocate for acceptance of physical differences, but to render those differences invisible through whatever technical means necessary. This philosophy extended to Burr's privacy about all aspects of his personal life, including his sexuality, as well as his physical condition. By maintaining strict separation between his public persona and his private reality, he protected himself from the industry's potential judgment about any aspect of his life that didn't conform to its narrow expectations. Burr's success, despite his physical difference, demonstrates something important about television stardom, reflected the television historian. Audiences connected with the authority and intelligence he projected, not the physical perfection the industry typically demanded. His limitation remained hidden, not because viewers would have rejected him if they had known, but because the industry's gatekeepers assumed they would, a distinction that reveals more about Hollywood's biases than the audience's. While Burr maintained complete privacy about his physical condition, our final subject dealt with a more minor, but still concealed difference, one that, while invisible to viewers, represents Hollywood's obsession with controlling every aspect of a star's physical reality.
I was very sorry I couldn't come here before when I did my tour, but it just didn't work out with the houses and the dates.
Marlene Dietrich, the perfect illusion with hidden imperfection. Marlene Dietrich epitomized Hollywood glamour, the German-born actress whose perfect legs, immaculate style, and carefully constructed image made her one of cinema's most enduring icons. From The Blue Angel to Touch of Evil, She projected a flawless, controlled presence that revealed exactly what she wanted audiences to see and nothing more. What those audiences never knew was that beneath her perfect exterior lay a minor but carefully concealed physical difference, partially webbed toes that she and the studio system worked tirelessly to keep hidden from public view. Dietrich reportedly had mild syndactyly, partial webbing between several toes, explained a costume historian who has studied classic Hollywood wardrobes. By modern standards, it would be considered a minor cosmetic difference of no functional significance. But in the perfection-obsessed culture of Golden Age Hollywood, even this invisible flaw became something to be hidden at all costs. According to accounts from Dietrich's personal stylists and wardrobe assistants, the actress was intensely private about this physical difference. She wore closed-toed shoes whenever possible, even in casual settings, where sandals would have been appropriate. On the rare occasions when a role required her to appear barefoot, special efforts were made to film her feet from angles that would not reveal the webbing. Dietrich's case reveals the psychological impact of Hollywood's impossible standards, observed a psychologist specializing in body image issues. Even a physical difference that was literally invisible to the public most of the time became a source of potential shame because it contradicted the narrative of physical perfection that surrounded her. The fear wasn't that webbed toes would affect her performance, but that knowledge of any physical imperfection might shatter the carefully constructed illusion of her flawlessness. This concern wasn't irrational in the context of how studios marketed their stars during the Golden Age. Publicity departments created narratives of physical perfection that allowed no room for even minor variations from the ideal. Stars were presented not as human beings with normal physical differences, but as flawless embodiments of beauty that existed beyond ordinary human limitations. Dietrich understood the contract she had with her audience, said a film historian specializing in star image creation. They came to see not just a talented actress, but a living fantasy, someone who embodied perfection in every detail. Revealing even a minor physical difference risked breaking that fantasy and reminding audiences that she was, in fact, a flesh-and-blood woman, rather than the immaculate creature they believed her to be. What makes Dietrich's situation particularly noteworthy is how successfully she controlled her image throughout her life. Unlike many stars whose carefully constructed facades crumbled with age or changing fashions, Dietrich maintained near total control over how she was seen, photographed, and remembered. Her minor physical difference remained largely unknown until after her death, revealed primarily through accounts from those who had worked closely with her. Dietrich's management of her physical reality was masterly, reflected a biographer who has studied her career. She understood that in Hollywood, perception was reality, and she controlled that perception with iron determination. Her syndactyly remained private, not because it would have ended her career if known, but because she refused to cede control of her image in even the smallest detail. This commitment to perfect image management extended throughout Dietrich's career and life. As she aged, she became increasingly reclusive, preferring to be remembered as the flawless beauty of her earlier films rather than allowing the public to see the natural effects of time. Her concealed webbed toes were simply one aspect of a larger philosophy about public image, that legends are created through careful curation of what is revealed and what remains hidden. In many ways, Dietrich's webbed toes serve as a perfect metaphor for Hollywood's entire approach to physical difference, concluded the film historian. Even the most minor, inconsequential variation from perfect became something to be hidden, controlled, and denied. The system wasn't just selling movies, it was selling an impossible physical ideal that even its most beautiful stars